So, why do we play as Link? I'm assuming that if you clicked on this video that you have at least a passing knowledge of The Legend of Zelda, but let's give a brief overview. The Zelda series is a long-running video game franchise that sees the continuous retelling of a singular legend. A courageous hero and a wise princess work to stave off the powerful manifestations of an ancient evil. This is the basic story for every Zelda game, every entry operating as a reimagination of that same legend. In a series that is exceedingly interested in its own myths, with characters reprising their roles in an ever-repeating karmic cycle, the answer for why we play as Link is extremely simple. He is the hero, and for all its oddities and lore, Zelda is still a fundamentally classic fantasy adventure. From a meta-narrative standpoint, Link is our vessel, our stand-in. Longtime Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma says this about Link. When a player is playing a Zelda game, my desire is for the player to truly become Link. That's why we named him Link, so the player is linked to the game and to the experience. This idea of Link as surrogate for the player even informs how he has been designed throughout the years, with Aonuma stating in a 2016 Time interview that, back during the Ocarina of Time days, I wanted Link to be gender neutral. I wanted the player to think maybe Link is a boy or a girl. If you saw Link as a guy, he'd have more of a feminine touch, or vice versa. I really wanted the designer to encompass more of a gender-neutral figure, so I've always thought that for either female or male players, I wanted them to be able to relate to Link. Series creator Shigeru Miyamoto has given alternate explanations for Link's name, stating that he is named for how he connects people together and how he is a link between past and future, to spread the scattered energy of the world through the ages. I think this is a case of multiple things being true, and all serves to paint a broad picture of Link as both protagonist and our surrogate by design. So in 2024, when a new Zelda game was released without Link as our protagonist, I was a little shocked. This is a series that has been running for nearly 40 years as of this video, and ignoring a few notable exceptions, he has always been our player character. The fatigue of this series' conventions can be felt by any long-term fan. In Zelda's world of rigid roles and looping prophecies, shifting the title of protagonist to our wise princess would promise to bring a new perspective on this well-trodden tale. I understand, of course, that these are quite lofty expectations to bring to a third-party developed top-down Zelda game, but I fear this is precisely the kind of person that I am, by design. When I first played Echoes of Wisdom at launch in 2024, I found myself apprehensive. I had at this point already reached a sort of disillusionment with the Zelda franchise that began with a creeping sense of dread on a botched replay of Breath of the Wild that was fully solidified after a frankly negative experience with the then barely year-old Tears of the Kingdom. Whether you like this wild duology or not, their open-world design serves a very different master than the one who governs the design of a more traditional Zelda experience. At Echoes of Wisdom's release, it had been over a decade since the last true original top-down Zelda adventure in 2013's A Link Between Worlds, which with its key item rental system and segmented non-linear chunks serves as a stepping stone for the franchise's inevitable full embrace of open-world design. This puts Echoes of Wisdom in a tough but unavoidable spot. With a growing portion of the Zelda fanbase longing for a game with a more bespoke, intentional design with its dungeons and puzzles, you can't help but wonder what shape this game's structure is going to take. It's important to try and take each entry into a series, especially with franchise media, as its own singular work to some extent. Echoes of Wisdom is understood and designed around potentially being someone's first Zelda game after all. However, with the countlessly retold myth being a core tenet of this particular franchise's ethos, it becomes difficult to not have this game in conversation with all of the entries that came before. With a franchise that has run for so long, you have people like me who have been along for the majority of the ride, and with that comes unavoidable feelings and expectations. I do think it is important to state that I try to put my expectations to the side. I understand that expectation can get in the way of seeing what a work is trying to accomplish, and in discussing this game, I really am trying to meet it where it's at, with an open mind. So, in fall of 2024, the game is loaded into my Switch with a mess of complicated thoughts perhaps undeservedly laid at its feet. This style of Zelda, the top-down view of old, is one I frankly thought time was leaving behind. This is a game that I want to be in love with. And yet, this first playthrough still had that faint but familiar sense of obligation that I felt all throughout my time with Tears of the Kingdom. Despite some cynical skepticism though, I had an overall warm time with the game. It played a Zelda adventure straight, accomplished series conventions with seeming competence, and in a world where 100+ hour campaigns are becoming the norm, Echo's relatively breezy 20-hour campaign was a welcome treat. The dungeons were a bit too simple, even for a children's game, but the hard mode I chose on this first playthrough proved to be a somewhat engaging challenge to get off the ground, with this first hour of a playthrough seeing most monsters kill you in a single hit. This core idea, the monster summoning gimmick, is a strong enough concept that it makes you wonder why there isn't a Pokemon adventure with a similar mechanic. But the execution of this summon 'em all gameplay baffled me in a way that makes me question what kind of playtest process this game went through. I was left with a conflicted, if not decent, impression of my time with the game. At around the midpoint of this first playthrough, I vaguely remember thinking that if Zelda continued in this way, I wouldn't think it was 5 stars, but I'd think it was okay. But there was this lingering feeling that kept bothering me. I kept waiting to come across some post or video that would help me crystallize what it was, but even after the adventure, there was still a hole in this game. And so it's that same 25-hour runtime that makes a revisit all the more enticing. I'll forever champion a shorter game, but I suppose we really should start going into detail to explain to both you and me what it means for this game to have a hole in the middle. Nintendo began co-development of Echoes of Wisdom with Japanese developer Grezzo, who has worked with Nintendo on remakes of their games, including, most notably for today's topic, 2019's remake of Link's Awakening for the Switch, which Echoes of Wisdom shares a substantial amount of DNA with. On their official site, Nintendo releases a series of developer interviews called Ask the Developer that provides insights into the creation of their major releases. The series on Echoes of Wisdom features longtime producer Eiji Aonuma, Tomomi Sano, co-director from Nintendo and first woman to direct a Zelda game, and Satoshi Terada, co-director from Grezzo's side, who first got involved with the series with the 3DS remake of Ocarina of Time, working mostly in level design. Aonuma mentions a desire to create a top-down Zelda series that can be considered separate from the main 3D Zelda entries. The series is no stranger to the concept either. In previous generations, this was the realm of the handheld entry, also often third-party developed like Capcom's flagship team's Oracle of Seasons and Ages for the Game Boy Color, which released during a time when Zelda was fully establishing its place in 3 dimensions. Capcom and Flagship would also go on to develop the Minish Cap on the Game Boy Advance, with Nintendo developing the top-down adventures Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks for the DS and A Link Between Worlds for the 3DS. So then it's with the Switch merging Nintendo's handheld and home console lines that we see Aonuma searching for a way to continue Zelda's top-down entries, noting that this gameplay tradition has its own unique characteristics that he wants to keep relevant as the series evolves. Aonuma praises Grezzo's remake of Link's Awakening for the Switch, saying that, "We felt that the remake had become our new approach in terms of graphics and gameplay feel. Grezzo had established an excellent way of reviving the top-down Legend of Zelda experience for a modern era, so I thought we could develop something completely new that had never been done before." When searching for the brand new idea, employees at Grezzo were all asked to pitch concepts on how to make this game stand out. After years of working on Zelda remakes, employees were eager to propose ideas at a new game's conception. Eventually, after days of reviewing pitches, the main mechanic of copy-and-paste gameplay, with a focus on both top-down and side-view action, was chosen for Echoes. With this direction, Aonuma added a third focus for the team, an emphasis on freedom. "We feel that fans may not continue playing this franchise unless they can think independently and try various things freely on their own, rather than following a set path. Even when it comes to solving puzzles, in a game in the Legend of Zelda series, having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Legend of Zelda-like." This idea of a copy-and-paste design led the team to initially begin developing Echoes as an edit dungeon, not too dissimilar to the initial designs for Zelda's first entry for the NES, which had players designing dungeons for others to explore, before settling on the adventure format that we know today. This edit dungeon gameplay was prototyped for Echoes for roughly a year before eventually becoming a traditional Zelda adventure with a non-traditional way to interact with the world, and a non-traditional hero. And yet, oddly, the opening of Echoes of Wisdom sees us in control of Link. This intro serves as a tutorial of sorts for the secondary playstyle of Echoes, a sort of power fantasy version of Link, starting with 2 rows of hearts instead of the usual meager 3, limitless ammo, and far more verticality than most of his top-down predecessors. The opening minutes of this game operate as an abridged version of the climax of a typical Zelda adventure, storming a dank dungeon full of armored foes while playing energy tennis with Ganon while a helpless Princess Zelda looks on from a familiar crystalline prison. It's all very typical, and I think intentionally so. Ganon's expected defeat sees him dissolving into mist, purple cracks forming from where his trident pierced the ground, and they grow, swallowing our hero. The camera then pans to our true protagonist, and in a somewhat joyful moment of design, you aren't immediately prompted to take control. The cracks in the ground continue to grow, and it's through a crumbling version of those same hallways we just soared through that we see the difference in power. With only 3 hearts and a significantly diminished jump, an obvious juxtaposition is made between our 2 leads. As we arrive home at our castle, we see that these cracks are continuing to form, swallowing our father, the king, and his advisors. Strange red-eyed doppelgangers materialize from this void, with the imposter king imprisoning us to await our execution. Only 20 minutes in and our hero has been captured twice. But it's in our gloomy cell that we are introduced to our main ally, Tri. Seemingly a mix between a lemon and a child's doodle, Tri acts as our guide for the new ecosystem, manifesting a magic rod that allows us to copy and paste objects and creatures that we find throughout the world. I wish there was more to say about Tri. Their Tale of Triangles operates as a clever on-screen indicator of how many copies we can still make, and their story has shades of the android learning feelings that are neat, but surface level enough that they are hardly worth mentioning beyond this. Avoiding guards who seem all too eager to place a young girl destined for execution back in her cell, we use our newfound skills to escape the dungeons of our own castle. Zelda's aide Impa, and apparently the only member of the castle staff not hungry for the gallows, helps us escape. Very importantly, it's here where we don the literal mantle of the previous protagonist, using his hood to disguise ourselves, that the kidnapping mostly stops, and we begin our adventure properly. These ever-growing holes in the world serve as our primary motivation, their closing being the objective of every major settlement the journey sees us visit. As we enter Southern Village, hometown to Link, we see that the damage of these rifts is widespread. It's through dialogue with villagers and a diary you can stumble upon later that we begin to get a broader picture of who Link is in this world. One of many children stolen away into these rifts, Link found a way to bring himself and his fellow children back, but lost his voice in the process. The reason he doesn't speak in this game. He continued his campaign against the monsters spawning from these rifts, but was lost in saving us. Picking up where he left off, equipped with his sword and wearing his hood, we continue on our quest. In these dungeons, you won't find any tool like a hookshot to help you cross gaps or a boomerang to hit faraway switches. Instead, you will use the echoes you find and they work to solve the puzzles within. For example, finding and defeating a spider will reward you with the ability to summon it at will as an echo, using its strings to cross gaps. This is a no doubt interesting subversion of the typical growth progression of a Zelda adventure, but the act of discovering the game's 127 echoes is so frequent that the excitement of a new tool discovered is met with an almost immediate annoyance at the ever-growing list of echoes that, while sortable, is an increasing headache to manage. The question also must be asked, is this cumbersome system worth it? Before, seeing a switch across a gap meant throwing a boomerang at it. Maybe going into a menu to equip it if you didn't already have it on, but Echoes instead has you scroll through a bloated horizontal list to find a moblin with the boomerang, summon him, and then you wait for him to throw a boomerang at the switch for you. Why? Is this the fantasy of being Princess Zelda? I don't think so. That's a reductive read on her character that hasn't been close to true for decades. And this mismatch of gameplay, character, and campaign are at the core of what's off. Without the newness of a first playthrough, I find myself at a loss for anything to gush about in this first act of the game. I'm preemptively finding the most optimal solutions for most problems, eager to take advantage of the ability to make a list of favorites. A feature so obvious that it is truly shocking that it was only added in a post-release patch. Already in the first few dungeons, the amount of interesting echoes I've found, beyond ones that mitigate a pathetic starting jump height, are startlingly low. At this point, I have roughly 90 left to find, and I'm acutely aware of how few of them have interesting uses and how many of them are higher-tiered versions of enemies I've already fought or different textured furniture. Once you have acquired an echo for combating aerial foes, found water cubes, flying tiles, and the ever-useful plat boom in these early hours, there are few game-changing echoes to look forward to finding. And besides powering up Link mode enough to carry me through most combat scenarios, little is really exciting about this growth progression. Like Tears of the Kingdom before it, I feel as if this game has shaken a bunch of loosely connected toys in the ground and asked me to make my own fun. By nature of being able to approach problems from many directions, the problems themselves have to be sanded off. We've mentioned Aonuma's quote before that having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Legend of Zelda-like, but is this true? I don't think so. I think it might be recently true, but puzzle designs of Zelda before the release of Breath of the Wild were typically the kind with very intentional solutions. What's interesting is that this game seems to actually agree with this by nature of the sheer simplicity of most of its puzzles. You could theoretically make them harder by way of extraordinary thinking, but most puzzles have solutions so simplistic that it makes you wonder if this copy and paste mechanic ever had legs to begin with in a dungeon crawling adventure structured like this. Even when chasing after a rampaging river spirit, the game's score remains a soothing lullaby, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I really can't overstate how much I love this soundtrack. Paired with the visuals that make you look like you are looking down into a living Fisher-Price world, there's an obvious comfort that comes from simply moving through space in this game. Echoes retains a somewhat dreamy tone through the course of its adventure due to this. Looking past the repetitive back-and-forth mission structure and tiring mechanics, I can see a version of this game that works effortlessly, and that's its predecessor. A remake of a much more tightly designed game with a unique and strangely somber narrative, whose aesthetic that this game has lifted wholesale, but has done little to make itself stand apart. At this point in the adventure, nothing is fundamentally changed by us being Zelda. While there is a brief moment where I hesitate to throw the pottery I find in a loyal subject's home, Echoes doesn't work hard to sell me on the idea of role-playing as the princess. Besides a lack of offensive ability that the game is desperate to counteract, at its core this feels like a typical Zelda campaign. Solving every major problem plaguing Hyrule involves little more than the standard dungeon crawling and monster slaying. While it's understood that these are things that solve problems in a world like Hyrule, it's the disharmony with our player character in this fact that leaves this game feeling as if it's always timidly placing the conventions in front of us with little to say. Like it's eager to appear fresh and new, but playing it too safe and serving far too many masters to accomplish anything besides tired series staples with confidence. It's with the closing of the rifts in the desert that we encounter the Gerudo tribe. If you squint hard enough, you can see a parallel story to Zelda being told here with Dona, daughter of the Gerudo chief, who struggles to have her voice heard in the fate of her people. However, it's in these first 3 major quests that Echo's overuse of dialogue is becoming hard to ignore. Much is said and repeated to little purpose. It's true that as the series has gone on, the word count has only grown larger, but Echo's dull, by-the-numbers script seems to serve little purpose beyond highlighting every destination on your journey for you and lengthening the playtime. It's worth noting that in my first playthrough, I would often explore on my own before contending with an area's quest, but this would frequently have me reaching dead ends that could only be progressed by continuing on the main quest. Knowing this, my second playthrough has been significantly less frustrating, but following the constant waypoints marked on your map inevitably leads this game to feeling a bit like a guided tour through Hyrule, where opposite of the game's ostensible intent, it's your best bet to let the train follow the tracks. Where Dona was able to defy orders to bring about peace, our protagonist has little growth to do. She has seemingly always been graceful, wise, and kind, and besides the game nodding slightly at an overprotected upbringing, Zelda changes little throughout her journey. In previous games, it was Link who was the silent and somewhat stagnant protagonist, and Zelda was the one with a more robust character arc. This game bafflingly chooses to silence both of them. It's with the closing of a rift at Hyrule Castle, where we fight a repeat battle with an echo of Ganon, that Link and Zelda find themselves briefly reunited, before Link is taken away by the true source of the rifts and dark echoes. The art style for this game, while charming, greatly reduces how a character can convey feeling. So with neither protagonist able to speak or seemingly emote, this scene does little to convey any kind of relationship, which just feels strange in a game so positioned to do so. It's no secret to anyone that our titular girl is frequently delegated to the sidelines of her own stories. We spent some time at the beginning of this video talking about Link, what he is designed for, and why he is named as he is. In the opening to the Hyrule Historia book, Shigeru Miyamoto lends us many insights into the creation of this franchise, but interestingly, very few words are used to describe Zelda herself in this intro, stating that she was conceived as a timeless beauty with classic appeal. And when describing how the series progressed, Miyamoto mentions that Link has gone from a bunch of pixelated dots and is now a hero who appears fearless, capable of realistic and free movement. Ganon has turned into a powerful archvillain, and Zelda, an incredibly beautiful woman. There's an obvious subtext that goes unsaid when talking about Zelda. While not as narratively ignored as some of her contemporaries, it isn't until her 4th major entry in 1998's Ocarina of Time that she begins to truly be positioned as an actor in her own story, with agency more equivalent to her fellow main characters in Ganon and Link. While indeed needing rescuing in the end of that story, it is her actions as a prudent child that set the plot into true motion. And it's through this and her guiding mysterious alter ego Sheik that we begin to see a more three-dimensional picture of what wisdom might look like for someone who needs to use its power to retain peace. This trend continues with Tetra of Wind Waker, who serves as a mirror to Ocarina's Sheik. Instead of being the alter ego of the princess, Tetra is instead who she truly is in this era. Leader of a pirate crew on a world whose surface is almost entirely sea, we see that wisdom is not as inherently aligned with virtue in this world as we might think. Shrewdness can be as needed and powerful as prudence after all. Wind Waker's is a story specifically about eschewing the conventions of the past. When Tetra is eventually transformed into the fair-skinned Zelda, her agency in the story is brought to a screeching halt. This seems like intentional commentary. In this frozen-in-time, lost version of Hyrule that the narrative seems to agree has to be let go, we see her happy ending with her back to who she is, not who fate says she has to be. I don't think you have to subvert tropes or comment on them to tell interesting stories with them. I'm just mentioning this to illustrate that there are choices to be made with this character, and I think Echoes is too afraid to make any. It's in later entries in the series that we begin to see Zelda as more of a deitic figure, with the version of her that appears in 2011's Skyward Sword being a direct reincarnation of a previously unnamed goddess, Hylia. Both this game and Breath of the Wild see Zelda on her own parallel journey to Link, hers being one of spirituality and sanctification to gain access to her own divine power. In that intro to the Hyrule Historia, Miyamoto has this final thing to say about Link's role as our protagonist. I said the name Link came from his role as a connector, but Link is you, the player. And it's with all of this that I think I've come to my point. Echoes of Wisdom has a hole in the middle of its design, and it's right in the middle of the screen. Zelda is not the protagonist of this adventure. The shape of her narrative, the world she inhabits, and the journey she goes on is not built for her. Instead of her adventure and her story, she's just taking Link's place. This is achingly felt in the ever-present Link mode that is always only a button press away. Bafflingly, by inhabiting her, she has transformed into the silent fixer, and no one has taken her place in the narrative. It's as I read Part 3 of the Ask the Developer series for Echoes of Wisdom that I begin to see exactly why. This is a game far more interested in being a unique, copy-paste sandbox game than Zelda's first adventure. Indeed, she's not on a quest unique to the kind of hero she is. Instead, pun quite intended, she's just filling a void. Aonuma states that, "We were initially thinking that Link would be the protagonist, but when we focused on the gameplay using echoes and had Link copying and pasting things into the game field, the sword and shield got in the way. If you have a sword and shield, you can just fight using those. There's no need to rely on the monster's power, right?" He and Terada go on to discuss that there were plans to eventually reward the player the sword and shield, but found that once introduced, there was no reason to rely on the other gimmick. It seems at odds with this principle, then, that the game still has the sword as the most optimal and efficient strategy to solve virtually 90% of the game's combat scenarios. Aonuma says, "Over the years we've been working on the Legend of Zelda series, many people have often asked us, will Princess Zelda ever be the protagonist? When asked this question, I've always thought, of course, as long as it makes sense for the game and does justice to her as a character. When I saw the team struggling to identify the ideal protagonist for the game, I thought, this is exactly the game for her." It seemed that the team had a hard time figuring out what kind of adventure might work for Zelda, and after 9 days of running boot camps to make a story, Aonuma says that, even there, Grezzo didn't offer any in-depth suggestions about the story at first, so I went back to the hotel, quickly wrote a script that would work, and brought it with me the next day. Then we all contributed various elements that often occur in the Legend of Zelda series to the script. Using this method, we eventually completed the game's story. Even in these sanitized corporate interviews, a subtle story of mismatched parts and wasted time shows through. I really do want to try and give this game some grace in its second act. While I obviously don't think that Aonuma's vision of a game that does justice to Zelda's character came to fruition, I can respect what does work about the game, and I want to give it its flowers when I can. With the Rift at Hyrule Castle sealed, it's revealed that 3 more have cropped up, this time in the 3 regions most closely associated with the Golden Goddesses, recurring creator deities in Zelda lore. This leads the king to conclude that our unnamed antagonist is after the goddess's power, and he tells us a familiar legend of a wise priestess and a courageous hero who will one day fight against such a foe. I'm actually quite fond of this idea of Zelda as priestess in the myth. It seems fitting with the more divine journey she has been on in recent installments. And even if it is just lip service, at the end of the day I'm still going to a temple to solve puzzles and fight a boss, I like that the game has at least alluded to a unique quest for Zelda. The journey in the Fair and Wetlands sees Zelda coming across a fat-obsessed tribe of Deku Scrubs who are so hopelessly addicted to eating spiderwebs that they have lost sight of all reason, eager to prove to others that they're in the in-group and not bumpkins. The script here often had me genuinely chuckling. As opposed to the straightforward journeys of previous areas, there is a unique voice and tone here. From a panic-ridden lovebird who interrupts your cutscene to jump into the void ahead of you, to an escape sequence that robs you of your tools, this area feels the most robust and varied in its scenario. The dungeon of this area has the strongest visual identity in the game as well, having you weave in and out of hidden entrances in and outside of the temple, lighting pitch-black rooms within. While I am being positive though, I just have to mention, isn't there something that feels particularly low rent about Gohma's boss cutscene? The obviously copy and pasted spider webs, her model clipping egregiously through the webbing. It's honestly hard to ignore. It straight up looks goofy, but I'm gonna try not to be petty. Once the Deku Scrubs are shown the error of their ways, they are quick to hop on to the next trending food item, and it's here where I'd like to talk about what I think is Echo's best system. At first I was a bit perplexed when I learned that as opposed to the traditional potions that Link quaffs, Zelda instead would mainly be drinking smoothies. A knee-jerk reaction would have me saying something about how this is a strange choice for the first female-led Zelda game, but the concept is so fun and silly in its execution that I can't help but like it. In these open-world games, it's often very difficult to incentivize exploration. Essentially, if the player has full access to the world, every reward they find tends to be on some level equal. Heart pieces and the bismuth crystals you use to power up your Link mode make for obvious fodder, but most enemy encampments or optional chests contain rupees or smoothie ingredients. In my first playthrough I found this exhausting, and this prospect of useless chests did little to make me want to comb the map as I had figured out what smoothie worked best for me and rarely needed more money. It's in attempting to complete what I am going to lovingly refer to as the smoothie decks that this exploration loop kinda clicked for me. Unlike most cooking systems, Echoes has you only combining 2 ingredients at a time. While this could seem to be an oversimplification of the cooking system from Breath of the Wild, in practice this allows you to suss out all available recipes yourself through low-stakes trial and error. The game only has rewards for crafting 20 of the 69 available recipes, but it was an oddly satisfying fixation I had on this playthrough. The smoothies kept me in constant supply of any healing or energy recovery I might need, and while I'm sure it served to make the playthrough easier, it's in engaging with this mechanic fully that I think I see the greater loop they may have had in mind. Since our echoes essentially give us free reign of the map, both horizontally and vertically, strange strips of liminal borderlands crop up between the major areas. It's in nooks like these that we find places to fill out our stamp cards, given to us by the enigmatic stamp guy. There are 25 of these spots tucked away throughout the corners of Hyrule. This stamp rally, while basic in how you interact with it, gives ample incentive to fill out the map. Like the Deku Scrubs before him, Stamp Guy is a large source of personality in an otherwise somewhat typical cast. With his cards stamped with sculpted, realistically muscled versions of himself, and an interest in stamps so all-encompassing it has rendered any other kind of personal identity void, he's one of the few characters new to this game that sticks out in my memory. Finishing the stamp rally rewards you with his outfit and a revelation. As a child, Stamp Guy's mother rewarded him with a stamp every time he completed a chore, and he's been chasing that high ever since. He's Stamp Guy because he loves stamps. The next area we visit is the volcanic home of the Gorons. This quest sees us following a young Goron chief, Darstan, who is struck with indecision, anxiously focused on the nuggets of wisdom carved on the tablet left behind by his late father. Like Dona before him, Darstan does continue this vague, overarching theme of young leaders finding their confidence. And at this point, that's really enough to leave me with some sort of narrative satisfaction. Though I have to mention, did we not just help a young Goron chief find his confidence not too long ago? Unlike previous areas that had you closing multiple rifts before gaining access to the dungeon, this area only has you entering the main temple rift, with the other destinations being shockingly short compared to the lead-up quests of previous temples. While this might indicate this area being rushed in development, this hastening of the journey actually makes this part of the game feel light and breezy, where before it could feel like a bit of a chore. I can't help but mention the necessary destruction of a portrait of the orphan boy's father on our journey to save the world. Unfortunately, with only one true major dungeon ahead of us, I can't help but notice I've never had more than one key on my person at a time, and the only time I've encountered a locked door without a key is not from getting turned around in a confusing labyrinth, but instead, when presented with up and down, I chose up first, when the key was down. Coming off of the last top-down adventure, A Link Between Worlds, with its intricate dungeon design and its later depths, the complete sanding off of any dungeon complexity is really hard to ignore in this game. There's a fine line to be towed when making a game for all ages, but there is an unmistakable lack of challenge here when compared to even the easiest of other Zelda entries. In sealing the volcanic rift, we commune with our next goddess, who shows us the source of the rifts. Long before Hyrule's creation, there was simply void. Occasionally, things would manifest in the void, but they were all quickly devoured by a thing named Null. Unable to abide by this, the 3 golden goddesses used all of creation as a prison to keep Null at bay, creating the tries to counteract its ceaseless attempt to eat the world. This is a genuinely interesting addition to the mythos, and I appreciate the bold swing of a new eldritch antagonist that existed before creation. I fear Null is introduced a bit too late for its presence to mark the story in any significant way, but in a game that seems afraid of big choices, I'm admittedly a fan of this one. The last dungeon we approach is Holy Mount Lanayru, only accessible by climbing the neighboring Heber Mountains. On the way, we meet a large antlered creature by the name of Konde. Konde is a sweet and somewhat simple Yeti who, while truly disconnected from the rest of the narrative, has an emotionally resonant story. With his brother on a faraway journey and his father long passed away, Konde is the last of his family. Lonely and kind, it's bittersweet to find that the creature we thought was Conde's lost brother is in fact just another echo of a dark monster. Conde's longing hope for his brother's return is reignited though, and his simple optimism is never shown as foolish or naive. It's a great little story. This final proper dungeon, which I like to call the Hebra HVAC system, has those warming and cooling rooms to melt ice and freeze water. This is a fun gimmick, but sadly, like so many of the puzzle ideas that came before it, by the time it feels like the game is done giving us tutorial puzzles with the concept, we are already at the dungeon boss. I really can't overstate this enough. There aren't meaningful choices to be made in nearly every puzzle or dungeon crawl in Echoes of Wisdom. At this point, the feeling that this is a guided tour through a typical Zelda adventure almost feels insulting. There's rarely a wrong way to do a puzzle, never a moment where I am stumped trying to find where my next turn in the maze is. It's at this point in my first playthrough I vaguely remember thinking that if they keep making top-down Zeldas of about this quality, I guess I can't complain, but now? I don't know. The closing of this final rift grants us our final sanction to access the goddess's power, but not before Null creates and inhabits an echo of our sanctified bodies. Here in the climax of our tale, with the fate of all of Hyrule hanging in the balance of our mad race to the Triforce, I must, of course, talk about side quests. Side quests in Echoes of Wisdom really are a mixed bag. It would be easy to harp on about how many of them are just checks to see if you have found the requisite echo, those echoes rarely being ones that you wouldn't find on the main path, but I think they go by fast enough that it's hard to ever be too upset about them. There are a few optional mini-dungeons that offer boons worthy of completing, and the mini-games are largely fun. They operate exactly as side quests should, little distractions to power up with as you digest the larger chunks of the game. This is normally where you might find the more colorful characters in another Zelda game, but besides the aforementioned stamp guy, there really aren't many of note. There's a lady who's lost her chickens, there's fetch quests to be done, but like so much of this game, even though they are largely pleasant enough, I can't shake this feeling of having been here and done this before. Aonuma's quote of filling the scenario with various elements that often occur in the Legend of Zelda series looms ever larger. The final leg of our journey sees us completing the questionably basic task of finding 6 objects in a small area before unlocking a familiar path to a very familiar face who has been duped by our dark copy. It's here where we see that the vague prime energy that has been mentioned is indeed the Triforce, separating when Null tries to claim it with an imbalanced heart. From here, it is another easily navigated stretch of disconnected platforms to find Link, culminating in a quick fight with our mirror. With Link freed, that hole in the middle is felt achingly again. Neither speak, neither seems to feel anything but stoic determination. I actually think it's an incredibly strong design choice to have us give Link his tools back for this finale, robbing us of that mitigating sword that is stuck so awkwardly into our adventure. From here we must enter into the large, dripping body of the Eldritch Null, the thick cells of his body illuminated with digested tries. While I really do hesitate to call this final area a dungeon, I think it's in these last few rooms that we see an echo of the game that this one could have been. The puzzles are still at a tutorial level of difficulty, but it is here where I am feeling for the first time the power fantasy of being Princess Zelda. And I know this is going to sound contradictory of me, especially after all that I've said so far, but when there's dark enemies around that need slayed or dungeons that need delved, she's got a guy for that. A guy that I very much missed. I obviously wish that there was something of a relationship to grab onto here, but like the intro of Tears of the Kingdom, seeing these two together in gameplay just feels right. So often they are separated, only ever able to interact in cutscenes, so despite my misgivings, I still think this is a strong finale. When I inhabit Link, I always smile when I'm finally reunited with my ever-distant soul sister, so here where there is only an awkward nod, I do feel a small sting, but I'll still take it. It's a bold choice to automate and take away a gameplay mechanic that players have spent the last campaign leveling, so in a game that has played it so safe for much of its runtime, I want to praise a strong final choice. The final boss isn't very challenging, mainly consisting of using Tri's magic to pull Null's juicy tendons out for Link to slash, but it has all the spectacle you'd want out of a last encounter. I'm feeling a little punch drunk here. The game is completely shrugging its shoulders at this point and saying that a finale without Link smacking a big bad with a sword isn't a finale it's interested in having, but it feels strangely earned. If at the end of the day this is a game that's painting by numbers, at least it's going out with a bang. Triforce, reclaimed by our two heroes, Null's core falls to the ground, gray and lifeless. Tri, empowered by the goddesses, removes all the rifts that erupted throughout Hyrule, and largely everything is put back exactly how it was. The credits show us a few glimpses of a Hyrule that has more integration between the separate villages, but on the whole, as always, Zelda is a story about returning to the comfort of status quo. In a game that talks a bit more than it probably should, how odd is it that, after all these years, when we finally see Link speaking, the game has everyone muted? It's not hard for me to find a concept to grab onto if I really want to like something, and I really do want to like Echoes of Wisdom. I'd say Stamp Guy is about the only thing to spark any kind of feverish excitement in me, with his frantic inability to talk about anything besides his special interest of stamps. But this playthrough left me with that same nagging feeling as before. As you may have noticed in gameplay footage, the map of this game is also an echo, sharing so much DNA with the maps of A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds that Hyrule feels like a somewhat tired imitation of itself. Tears of the Kingdom, which released a year before Echoes, shared a map with the previous entry Breath of the Wild. So to spend full price in a game that is an echo of an echo, obsessed with a gameplay mechanic that doesn't seem to work for the genre it is in, a game that's decidedly uninterested in asking what kind of adventure is fit for a woman like Zelda, that has a scenario that was damningly written in a night and then filled with various elements that often occur in the Legend of Zelda series, for seemingly no other reason than it's what's been done before and nothing else of interest came to mind. I don't know. Is that enough? In another universe where Nintendo hadn't merged its console and portable line, Echoes of Wisdom would have been a $40 game on the 5DS. It's the same predicament that the Pokemon series has begun to face. There are expectations that come with ostensibly being a console experience that titles like Echoes frankly don't meet. I can imagine this world where I'm happily playing a handheld Zelda game with a fun idea for a gimmick but without any kind of ambitious narrative, but that's not the world we're living in. If you walk into any major retailer, Echoes of Wisdom will be sitting on the shelf for full price a year after its release. I don't want to be a brat who's mad that his expectations weren't met, that his good friend Princess Zelda got a hand-me-down adventure almost as a consolation prize, but I just don't think it's very good. I'm probably in the minority here, I understand that. Echoes still has an overall favorable rating on Metacritic for whatever that's worth. And you know, I believe Aonuma when he said he wanted to save Zelda's debut as a protagonist for a game worthy of her. I also believe that Nintendo is largely a gameplay-first developer, and from what little we know of how this game was developed, it seems like they spent a long time fitting a square peg into a round hole, cutting pieces off to make it fit, so I don't know. The game's just at odds with itself. Early on, Tri let something damning slip about the process of closing rifts. The world isn't restored and put back in its proper place. Rather, it's just recreated with echoes. The original lost pieces remain floating, still and silent in the abyss. Isn't that funny? Listen, I know those were a whole lot of words about a game I thought wasn't very good, but boy, I sure am glad I gotta share them with you. I think it's finally out of my system. I'm probably not going to think about Echoes of Wisdom for a long time to come, he lied. If you made it to the end of this video, really thank you. I've wanted to do something like this for a long time now, and if you want to tell me that you'd like me to keep making videos like this, it really would help me out if you liked this video and thought about subscribing. It might seem silly, but it's about the only way to tell YouTube and me that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. I've got lots of stuff to talk about. There's a reality show whose social structure I'd like to map out in exacting detail, some closeted old men and an old doctor show I'd love to tell you about, and obviously I have a deep love for video games, and I'm already thinking about which Zelda game I can examine next. This is my first video essay, and it took way longer to make than I thought it would, but I loved doing it. So if I can justify spending more of my time making these videos, let me know. And if this video resonated with you, please comment below. I love this series, and I just know there's someone else out there who feels the same way I do about this interesting but ultimately flawed game. I can't thank you enough, and till I have something else to really gab your ear off about, snooze out! Oh wait, you're still here? Okay, while I still have you, let's talk about this. When I was gathering footage for some of the Wind Waker cutscenes, I forgot about Ganon's highest level henchmen in this game. The Dobermans, the big beefy Dobermans. Oh my god, what is going on with them? Why are they so big? And why do you take their clothes off to fight them? Do you think when they're back at Ganon's tower, he makes them all kiss?